Welcome to Reformed Thinking. Have you ever found yourself in a season where your spiritual life just feels like an absolute desert?
Yeah, that dry, empty feeling.
Right, like you wake up, you try to go through your normal routines, but the peace and the joy you used to experience they're just gone. The heavens feel like brass.
It's awful.
It really is. You sit down to read the Bible and the words on the page are flat. They feel like a dead letter. You try to pray and it feels like your thoughts are just bouncing off the ceiling and, well, mocking you.
Which is incredibly isolating.
Totally isolating. And then you look around at other people who seem to have a thriving, vibrant faith, and a very quiet, terrifying thought starts to creep in. You start to wonder if something is just broken inside of you that cannot be fixed.
Yeah, that fear of being permanently flawed.
Exactly that. So if you have ever experienced that kind of isolation, or if you are sitting in the middle of it right now, this deep dive is specifically for you.
I'm really glad we're doing this one.
Me too. Our mission today is to map out a very surprising pattern. We're going to look at how true, lasting hope is almost always preceded by severe trouble.
Right.
And we are going to look at why uncovering what the text calls the hidden Achan in your life, is the only genuine way out of that wilderness.
That's such a crucial concept.
It really is. So for our source material today, we are looking at a highly analytical sermon by the 18th century theologian Jonathan Edwards. He preached on the Old Testament book of Hosea chapter 2, verse 15.
Which is a heavy text.
Very heavy.
Yeah.
But he uses it to lay out a structural blueprint for how God operates. He breaks down the mechanics of humiliation and hope, and it completely flips the conventional wisdom on how to handle the dark seasons of life.
It really does. It's a remarkable piece of source material.
Right.
Edwards looks at this massive historical event regarding the ancient nation of Israel, and he scales those mechanics down to the micro level of the individual soul.
Mm.
He analyzes the precise methods God uses to deal with human beings. And what is so striking about his analysis is the complete lack of cheap comfort.
Oh, totally. No Band-Aids here.
Right, because we live in an era of quick fixes and, life hacks.
Mm-hmm.
But Edwards offers a rigorous, structurally sound understanding of why God actively orchestrates trouble. He argues that this trouble is the required prerequisite for any genuine peace.
Which is such a tough pill to swallow, but so necessary. Let's start right at the foundation of that blueprint, looking at Hosea chapter 2. To understand verse 15, we need to grasp the context of the chapter.
Yeah, setting the stage is key here.
Right. So Israel is being indicted. The accusation is spiritual adultery, and the imagery is incredibly harsh. Israel is acting as an unfaithful bride, chasing after other lovers.
And in the text, those lovers are her idols.
Yes. She is pursuing them for her bread, her water, her wool, and her flax. When you read that, you might expect God to respond with either immediate destruction or immediate gentle restoration.
That's a slap on the wrist or something.
Yeah, but the text does something very different. God says he is going to strip her bare. He says he will turn her fruitful vineyards into a forest and drive her out into the wilderness.
It sounds so severe.
It really does. But then, right on the heels of that terrifying threat, comes this staggering promise. God says he will allure her, he will speak comfortably to her, and he will turn the valley of Achor, which translates to the valley of trouble, into a door of hope.
That pivot is amazing.
It's wild. Why does the process start with deprivation? Why does God take away the corn and the wine before offering hope?
And well, God removes those comforts because human beings have an almost inescapable tendency to credit their idols for their blessings.
Oh, that makes sense.
The text is very explicit about this psychological dynamic. I mean, Israel is walking around saying, I will go after my lovers. They give me my bread and my water.
Wow, giving them all the credit.
Exactly. She looked at her agricultural abundance, her financial security, her national safety, and she attributed all of that provision to the false gods she was worshiping. As long as the corn and the wine are flowing, the illusion remains intact. The idol appears to be doing its job.
So the deprivation it's a reality check.
Spot on. God responds by removing the provision to force a confrontation with reality. By stripping the environment bare and turning the fruitful, cultivated vineyard into a wild, desolate forest, God shatters the illusion.
Because you can't fake it in the forest.
Right. The wilderness is an environment of total deprivation. Out in the desert, you cannot rely on your own strength, and your false gods certainly cannot produce water from the sand. It is a forced realization of absolute vulnerability.
God takes away the gifts so the people will finally look up and acknowledge the giver.
Yes.
Think about how that dynamic plays out in a modern family. Imagine a parent dealing with a teenager who is completely absorbed in a smartphone.
Oh, yeah, great analogy.
Right. The child is ignoring their siblings, failing their classes, and totally disconnected from the real world. So the parent steps in and takes the phone away.
And chaos ensues.
Absolute chaos. But the parent does not do this out of malice or a desire to ruin the child's life. The goal is to get the child to actually look up, engage with their surroundings, and have a real conversation.
Yeah.
Now, the teenager experiences the removal of that screen as a severe punishment. To them, it is the total loss of their entire world. But from the parent's perspective, it is a rescue operation. The child is being saved from a digital stupor.
That's a really good way to look at it.
So is that a fair way to understand what God is doing with Israel in Hosea? Is the wilderness less about punitive anger and more about a rescue?
That framing captures the dynamic perfectly. The text itself uses a specific word that completely reframes the severe action of driving Israel into the desert.
What word is that?
After the threat of the wilderness, God says, I will allure her. Yeah. That word signifies courting. It is the language of wooing, the way someone pursues the person they desire to marry.
That's beautiful.
It is. God is treating this unfaithful people like a bride being courted all over again. The paradox here is astonishing. God forces her into the harshest, most barren environment on earth, and he uses that desolate setting for the most intense spiritual romance.
Wow.
He brings her into distress to humble her. Once she is stripped of her false lovers and her self-sufficiency is gone, he speaks comfortably and pleasantly to her. The trouble is the required setup for the romance.
And Edwards takes this macro-level historical blueprint and applies it directly to the micro-level. He argues this is the precise pattern for how God operates with every single individual at the moment of their initial conversion.
Right, he shrinks it down to the individual soul.
Yes, and he says the sequence is non-negotiable. Before God bestows true hope on a person, he brings them into their own personal wilderness.
Yes, the source material insists that God causes hope and comfort to arise in the soul only after trouble and humbling for sin.
Let's walk through that initial shock. According to Edwards' analysis, the natural state of humanity before any divine intervention is actually very quiet.
Too quiet, really.
Yeah, people feel secure. They are asleep to their actual condition. The text references the children of Israel when they were slaves in Egypt, telling Moses, "Let us alone, that we may serve the Egyptians."
Right, they didn't even want to leave.
The natural sinner does not want to be rescued. They are perfectly content making bricks in the mud. But when God begins his work, he deliberately ruins that false quietness. The worldly enjoyments that used to satisfy them suddenly stop working.
And that's when the panic sets in.
Exactly. The person starts wandering. The text describes them as having an arrow sticking fast in them. They are pinched and stung. They feel like David being hunted by King Saul from cave to cave, utterly unable to find a safe place to rest.
The psychological state described in this phase is one of escalating panic. The individual tries to find shade from the scorching sun, but every tree is barren. They look for a drop of water, but every well they check is dry. They flee to one refuge, but their anxieties beset them there, so they run to another, and that fails too.
Exhausted.
It really is. What is happening internally is a massive awakening to the reality of their disease, which is sin. The driving affection in this initial phase is fear. Theologians often call this legal repentance.
Legal repentance, not evangelical.
Right. It is not yet a pure evangelical love for God. It is raw, unfiltered terror. It is the fear of eternal judgment. It is the fear of having committed the unpardonable sin.
Which so many people struggle with.
Yes, it is the fear of death, the dread that God will never hear their prayers. It is a sorrow rooted entirely in self-preservation.
I can hear a modern listener pushing back on that concept, though.
Oh, for sure.
Because to modern ears, intentionally using raw terror to wake someone up sounds overly harsh. It sounds manipulative to inflict that level of psychological distress on someone just to get their attention. Why would a loving God utilize fear as an introductory tool?
It sounds harsh until you recognize the actual objective danger the person is in. Consider a different scenario.
Okay.
Imagine someone is fast asleep inside a burning building. You are standing outside on the sidewalk, and you see flames shooting through the roof. You pick up a brick and throw it straight through their bedroom window.
Which is terrifying for the person sleeping.
Very loud. The shattering glass is incredibly alarming. The person wakes up in a state of absolute shock and confusion, but breaking the window was not manipulative.
Right.
It was dictated by the reality of the fire. The false quietness of their sleep had to be ruined because the sleep was lethal. God uses fear to shatter the illusion of safety.
That makes total sense.
The goal of this legal trouble is to completely strip away self-trust. The sinner is like a person lost in a vast, dense forest. At first, they think they know the way out. They rely on their own wisdom, their own sense of direction, their own righteousness.
They think they have it under control.
Exactly. They walk for miles, exhaust themselves, only to realize they have walked in a giant circle and are right back where they started.
Oh, man.
The fear and distress keep them trying every possible path until they finally exhaust all their own resources. At that point, they stand completely still. They yield the case. They confess their utter blindness. They do nothing but scream for help. That is the necessary humbling.
And that brings us to a massive turning point in the analysis. Just screaming for help in the forest is not enough to finalize the rescue. The source material introduces a new historical parallel to explain the next required step.
Yes, a very intense one.
Something in the camp has to die before the comfort can arrive. We move from the book of Hosea into the book of Joshua, specifically the story of Achan. This story is central to the entire concept of the Valley of Achor.
It really anchors the whole idea.
Let's lay out the narrative. Israel has just crossed the Jordan River into the Promised Land. They experience a massive miraculous victory at Jericho. Then they go up against a tiny, seemingly insignificant city called Ai, and they are humiliatingly defeated.
Men die in the battle.
Yes, men die. Joshua is devastated. He falls on his face before God, asking why they lost. God tells him there is a troubler in the camp. Someone violated the command and took accursed things from Jericho.
Which was strictly forbidden.
Right. So conduct a tribe-by-tribe search, and the lot falls on a man named Achan. Achan confesses that he saw a beautiful Babylonian garment, 200 shekels of silver, and a wedge of gold. He wanted them, he took them, and he buried them in the earth right in the middle of his tent.
He hid them where no one could see.
Exactly. And to get God's presence back, the response is severe. Achan, his family, and all his possessions are taken to a place they name the Valley of Achor, the Valley of Trouble. They are stoned to death and burned with fire. A massive heap of stones is piled over them.
It's a brutal reality check.
It is. Edwards uses this brutal historical event to insist that sin cannot just be restrained or managed. It must be completely eradicated.
The distinction Edwards draws here is between partial reformation and true mortification.
Explain that difference.
Well, many people, when they are awakened by the initial fear of the burning building, will try to restrain their sin. They will give it slight wounds. They will clean up their outward behavior for a while to soothe their conscience.
Like putting a Band-Aid on a tumor.
Exactly. But the text argues that natural men are extremely loath to actually kill their sin. They have treated it as a familiar friend their entire lives. They give it the best room in their hearts. But God will never grant true, lasting comfort if the sin is kept alive.
You can't make a pet out of it.
No. You cannot do what King Saul did later in the Old Testament. God told Saul to completely destroy the Amalekites. But Saul spared Agag, the king of the Amalekites, and kept the best of the sheep and the oxen for himself.
Sparing the best part.
Right, and sparing the king cost Saul his own kingdom. True conversion requires you to take the sin, even the sin that seems most precious to you. As choice as Achan's silver and gold, and stone it, burn it, and bury it under rocks so it never rises again.
Let's bring that into a modern context. Think of finding a termite queen in your house.
Oh, I hate that thought.
Right. It's the worst. You notice some blistering on the drywall, so you get some spackle, patch the hole, and put a fresh coat of paint over it. You might even buy some bug spray and hit the baseboards.
Which feels like you're doing something.
It feels productive. That is partial reformation. The wall looks clean to anyone walking by. But the colony is still thriving inside the wood. If you want to save the house, you cannot just manage the visible symptoms. You have to take a sledgehammer, tear open the wall, find the queen, and exterminate her.
You have to go right to the source.
You have to destroy the source, even if it means ripping apart a room you spent thousands of dollars decorating. You have to be ruthless. But the source material brings up a very specific catch at this stage. We do not actually have the tools or the strength to exterminate the enemy ourselves.
That is the crucial theological pivot in Edwards' framework. We are commanded to ruthlessly renounce the sin, to turn our will entirely against it. But we are completely incapable of executing the final blow in our own strength.
We just don't have the power.
We don't. Edwards shifts the metaphor back to the Exodus to explain this mechanic. The Israelites are standing at the edge of the Red Sea. Pharaoh's highly trained army, with chariots and weapons, is charging at them. The Israelites are a group of escaped slaves.
Their trap.
They are completely trapped. They could never have fought off the Egyptians in a pitched battle, and they certainly could never have drowned them in the sea. The text points out that it was Christ, present in the pillar of cloud and fire, who executed the judgment.
He did the actual fighting.
The Lord fought for them while they stood still. The sinner must completely renounce their sin, treating it as a mortal enemy, but they must rely entirely on Christ's blood to act as the Red Sea that swallows the taskmasters.
That's a huge point.
The troubler is slain by a total reliance on Christ as a savior, not just from the punishment of sin, but from the active power of sin itself.
So, once the troubler is slain, the Red Sea closes over the enemy, the door of hope opens, and the soul is flooded with light and comfort. It sounds like a beautiful, definitive, one-time event. You cross the sea, the enemy is dead, and you are free.
It sounds nice.
It sounds great, but the source material takes a very sharp turn right here. It shifts to a startling reality that many listeners are going to relate to intensely. This pattern of trouble, slaying the Achan and renewed comfort, does not just happen once.
No, it doesn't.
It repeats itself in the lives of believers long after their initial conversion.
This is where the analysis becomes incredibly practical for the established Christian. Edwards acknowledges that Christians frequently fall into periods of intense darkness. Their hope is greatly obscured.
And just to clarify, he's not talking about losing salvation.
Right. He is not talking about a permanent loss of salvation, but he is describing a severe eclipse of their spiritual joy.
Let's describe what that eclipse actually feels like. The text paints a very vivid picture. The sweet influences of the Spirit are withdrawn. The mind is darkened. You open your Bible, and it is a dead letter.
You're just staring at pages.
Yeah, you have absolutely no taste for it. Reading the scriptures becomes a forced mechanical task. The verses that used to bring you light and reassurance do nothing at all. Prayer is heartless. You close your eyes and your mind wanders to 100 different vanities.
Which is so frustrating.
It is. You look at your daily life and you can hardly find any evidence that you ever had grace to begin with. Your past experiences of God feel dim, distant, and almost like a dream you are forgetting.
And it can get even darker than that.
Yeah, sometimes it is even worse than numbness. Sometimes there is an agonizing sense of God's anger. The text references David crying out about his broken bones, or Heman in Song 88 feeling trapped in the lowest pit with God's wrath lying heavy upon him.
It's real despair.
Why does this happen to someone who has already crossed the Red Sea? Why does a believer end up back in the dark?
The cause is always the same. According to this framework, there's a new Achan in the soul. Sin is the occasion for this darkness. Edwards points out three primary ways this Achan takes root in the life of a believer.
Okay, let's unpack those.
The first way involves the clash between weak grace and strong constitutional sins.
Let's break down that term, constitutional sins. What does that mean in everyday language?
It refers to a person's natural temperament or personality flaws. When someone is converted, the reigning power of sin is broken, but the presence of sin remains. And people have different natural dispositions.
Right, we all have our own struggles.
Exactly. Some people run hot. They have a disposition to high resentment and quick anger. Others are naturally prone to covetousness or financial anxiety. Some have a peevish, fretful, discontented spirit.
Always complaining.
Yeah. If the grace infused at conversion is comparatively weak, these constitutional sins take advantage. They flare up under stress, and they dreadfully cloud the mind.
So temperament is the first vulnerability. What are the other two ways the Achan gets into the camp?
The second way is through gross transgressions. This is the obvious scandalous failure. Edwards points to David falling into adultery and murder in the matter of Uriah.
Huge, catastrophic failures.
Right. That kind of severe, deliberate sin deeply quenches the spirit, and an exceedingly deep darkness immediately follows. But the third way is perhaps the most insidious and certainly the most common.
Which is?
It is a slow, almost imperceptible slide into corrupt frames and evil habits.
That slow slide is terrifying because you do not notice it happening. How does Edwards trace that descent?
It usually starts subtly, often by giving way to a slothful spirit. The believer is not as diligent as they once were. They discontinue their daily watchfulness.
Letting their guard down.
Yeah, they stop guarding their thoughts. From there, ill frames creep in. They might become worldly, their hearts desperately bent on acquiring goods or climbing the corporate ladder, or their minds grow light and vain, fixated on entertainment, dress, and outward appearances.
Very relatable stuff today.
Oh, incredibly. Or they become contentious, constantly arguing online, stirring up strife, demanding their own way, and feeling secretly bitter when others prosper. They slide from these corrupt internal frames into sinful outward practices.
They act on it.
Exactly. They allow themselves liberties in sensual appetites. This degenerate state of the affections causes God to withdraw his spirit, and the lights go out.
When a Christian slides into this state and the lights go out, does God hide his face because he has given up on them? Does he withdraw out of spite or frustration?
No, not at all.
Because if someone is sitting in that darkness right now, there are immediate visceral fears that God has abandoned them forever. How does this withdrawal square with the theological concept of eternal safety for the believer?
God hides his face precisely to keep them safe. It is an act of severe mercy.
Severe mercy.
Yes. The text explains that sin naturally darkens the mind. It opposes grace, just as thick clouds hide the sun. If sin is flourishing in a believer's life, grace is being suppressed.
If God were to allow the believer to continue feeling the warmth of spiritual comfort while they were actively harboring an Achan, it would be disastrous. They would feel a false peace while a poison was spreading through their system.
That would be deadly.
God withdraws the feeling of comfort so the believer cannot be comfortable in their rebellion. The darkness is a diagnostic indicator that something is critically wrong in the camp.
The believer in this backslidden state is essentially sleepwalking. The text references the parable of the 10 virgins. The saint is slumbering. Sin has a stupefying, numbing effect on the conscience, and God has a very specific and often very painful method for waking them up.
He brings the believer back into a second wilderness. He initiates a new work of awakening to rouse them out of their senselessness.
And this awakening is not a gentle tap on the shoulder.
No, it's rough.
Very rough. The text points to Job chapter 33, where the awakening involves severe temporal calamities. The person is chastened with pain on their bed, their bones stick out, their soul draws near to the grave. It is a terrifying realization of God's anger.
David is the classic example here.
Let's talk about David.
David lived in a state of total numbness to his own gross sin for months. He committed adultery, orchestrated a murder, and then just went back to running the kingdom as if nothing happened.
Just business as usual.
Exactly. He was completely stupefied. It was not until the prophet Nathan confronted him with the parable of the ewe lamb that the illusion shattered. Nathan looked at him and said, "Thou art the man." And suddenly the guilt crushed David.
But that severe awakening, that sudden, devastating crush of guilt, is actually the first pulse of returning life.
The pain of conviction is absolute proof that the soul is not dead.
Wow.
While they remain in their corrupt frames, they feel no pain because they are spiritually asleep. When God returns by his Spirit, the first thing he does is wake them up to the reality of their offense. The distress is almost insupportable, but their condition is infinitely more hopeful in the middle of that agony than when they were comfortably numb.
The analogy of frostbite helps clarify this intensely painful process.
That's a brilliant way to put it.
If you are out in the freezing cold and you get frostbite in your fingers, the initial stage is painful. But eventually, the nerves freeze and the numbness sets in. At that point, your fingers feel completely fine. You do not feel the cold anymore.
I think you're safe.
Right. The numbness feels peaceful, but it is the peace of tissue death. If you stay numb, you will lose your hand. When you finally get inside by a fire and begin the thawing process, the blood rushes back into the deadened vessels. That thawing process is agonizing.
It's excruciating.
It is some of the worst physical pain a person can experience. But the pain is a good sign. The pain means the tissue is alive. The pain means you are not going to lose the hand. The spiritual trouble, the renewed fear, and the crushing weight of guilt is the blood rushing back into a frostbitten soul.
And just like the physical thawing process, the spiritual trouble aggressively increases right before the comfort returns. Edwards points out that the darkest, most distressful hour, the moment when God's wrath feels the heaviest and the bones feel broken, is the immediate prelude to the dawn.
So once the saint is awake to the danger, once the frostbite is thawing, and they are in the agony of conviction, how do they actually step back into the light? We move into the renewal of hope.
The hope is renewed in the exact same way it was obtained the first time, by slaying the troubler once again. The believer must mortify the sin, but this time they have to do it with a renewed intensity.
What does that look like practically?
Edwards breaks this down into 3 requirements. First, the sin must be slain as to its former degrees. It cannot have the prevalence it once had in their daily routine.
Okay, that's one.
Second, it must be slain as to its former ways of exercise. The heart must be fortified against those specific paths of temptation that led to the fall.
You have to block the road.
Exactly. Third, the sin must be totally and perfectly slain in the will and inclination. The believer must act as a mortal enemy against the sin. They cannot deal mercifully or tenderly with it.
No more making excuses.
Right. They must have the zeal and revenge against their own sin that the Corinthians demonstrate in the New Testament. They must desire to completely extirpate it from their lives.
When this happens, a new light flashes out of heaven and comfort returns to the soul. But the text draws a very sharp line between genuine spiritual comfort and counterfeit comfort.
Which is a really vital distinction.
The difference between hypocritical joy and genuine spiritual joy is fascinating. False comfort brings pride. The hypocrite fixates on their own holiness. They think about how eminent a saint they are, how much better they are than their neighbors, and they assume God must love them because of their excellent religious experiences.
He's entirely self-focused.
True comfort works in the exact opposite direction. True comfort brings poverty of spirit. The person feels small, helpless, and wants to lie in the dust to exalt God. The text quotes Psalm 115.1, "Not unto us, O Lord, not unto us, but unto thy name give glory."
Gracious joy and poverty of spirit are inseparable companions in this theological framework. When God lifts the soul up with inward sweetness, he simultaneously casts it down with abasement. The believer sees the infinite gap between God's worthiness and their own undeserving nature.
So it's a very humbling joy.
Very humbling. If your religious comfort makes you feel large in yourself, if it makes you boastful, self-confident, or judgmental toward others, it is not from the Spirit of God.
There's a very specific trap mentioned here that we need to highlight. When people feel disconnected from God and are trying to find their way back out of the darkness, the most common advice you hear today is to look backward.
Yeah, you hear that a lot.
We are told to remember the days when we felt close to God, to review our old prayer journals, to reassure ourselves by analyzing past spiritual highs. The text argues this is actually a terrible idea. Why?
Because poring over past experiences while the Achan is still alive in the tent yields zero satisfaction. You are looking for a past trophy while a present troubler is actively killing you.
That is a stark way to put it.
But it's true. The text observes that believers in the dark will spend months or even years examining old evidences of their piety, trying to force comfort out of a memory. It is entirely in vain. The troubler must be removed.
You can't live on yesterday's grace.
Exactly. Once the Achan is slain, God gives new light and new experiences. And a few moments of fresh new light from God scatters the dark clouds far better than years of analyzing old memories. You do not need to excavate the past. You need to kill the sin in the present so the light can shine today.
Looking at old spiritual journals when you are harboring active sin is like looking at old photographs of the sun while you were standing in a dark room with the blinds closed.
That's a really good picture of it.
The photograph does not provide any heat. You have to open the blinds. You have to slay the troubler. So let's step back and look at the divine logic behind all of this. Why does God design the system this way?
There are specific reasons.
Why go through the wilderness? Why the cycle of trouble, slaying sin, and returning comfort? Why not just offer steady, uninterrupted peace from the moment of conversion to the end of life?
Edwards outlines 4 highly specific reasons God orchestrates the dark. First, to prepare the soul to trust Christ entirely. A believer wandering from God is like Noah's dove flying over the floodwaters, finding no rest anywhere else. The trouble ensures they find no solid ground until they return to the ark, which is Christ.
That makes sense. What's the second?
Second, to make comfort prized. Health is valued after a severe sickness. Safety is valued after a terrifying storm. By experiencing the terror of the wilderness, the believer learns to properly value the spiritual rest they've been taking for granted.
We tend to forget what we have until it's gone.
We really do. Third, to secure all glory for God. If humans were not humbled by their own failures, they would inevitably ascribe their deliverance to their own intelligence or willpower. The wilderness proves their helplessness so that God gets the absolute glory for the rescue.
Those first 3 make a lot of sense, but it is the 4th reason that really stands out. God uses the darkness to prevent the abuse of hope.
This is perhaps the most penetrating psychological insight in the entire sermon. If a person had full confidence of heaven, if they felt the absolute assurance of God's favor, while they were actively sinning, they would use that confidence as a license to sin more.
Because they feel invincible.
Exactly. When a believer is in a backslidden, carnal state, their love for God is dormant, and love is the primary internal restraint against sin. If love is asleep, something else must step in to restrain the believer, or they will run headlong into total destruction.
And what steps in?
That something else is fear. Since love is not active to hold them back, God withdraws the comfort, clouds their hope, and lets the fear of hell and the sense of his anger step in as the necessary external restraint.
That dynamic is exactly like installing a mechanical speed limiter on a teenager's car.
Oh, that's a great comparison.
Ideally, the teenager's internal sense of responsibility, their love for their parents, their respect for the law, their value for human life, keeps them driving at a safe speed. That is the internal restraint of love.
Which is how it should work.
Right. But teenagers are volatile. Sometimes they lose that internal responsibility and decide to floor the gas pedal to show off for their friends. When that happens, the mechanical restraint kicks in. The engine simply will not go past 65 miles per hour.
It just cuts them off.
The teenager hates the limiter. It frustrates them. They pound the steering wheel because they want to go faster, but that mechanical restraint is keeping them from driving off a cliff. When the internal restraint of love fails, the mechanical restraint of fear and the loss of comfort kicks in.
That analogy captures the brilliance of divine wisdom perfectly. The trouble is not a sign of God's hatred. The withdrawal of comfort is a perfectly calibrated mechanism to keep the saints safe and totally dependent. God loves the believer too much to let them feel comfortable while driving toward a cliff.
The loss of peace is the speed limiter engaging. Understanding the theory of all this is one thing, but the text does not leave us in the realm of theory. It ends with highly practical, urgent directions for the listener who is currently in the dark, wandering in that desert we talked about at the very beginning. It gives actionable guidance on how to dig up the tent.
The final directives are sharp and uncompromising. First, forsake all known sin immediately. This cannot be a temporary restraint while you wait for the storm to pass. It must be an everlasting renunciation.
A total break.
Yes. Second, earnestly seek conviction. Do not just wait to feel bad. Actively ask God to show you your true condition. Third, and this is the most critical directive, stop complaining about general corruption while ignoring specific active sins.
The detail about Achan in Joshua 7 is so telling here. Achan did not just toss the cursed items into his tent and leave them sitting out on the floor. The text points out that he dug a hole and buried them deep in the earth inside his tent. He hid them closely so there would be no sign of them above ground.
Which is what we all do.
We do the exact same thing with our behavior. We hide our darling sins under good names and respectable excuses. We bury them deep.
And because we bury them so deep, finding the troubler requires actual excavation. We have to dig up the ground, not just glance around the tent. Edwards notes a very common human tendency. We strain at gnats, but swallow camels.
I've heard that phrase. Unpack it for us here.
We are perfectly willing to confess general sins. We will happily sit in a church pew or a small group and say, I have a corrupt heart, I struggle with sinful thoughts, I fall short of the glory of God.
That's straining at a gnat.
Right. It is easy to confess what everyone else struggles with. It costs you nothing. But we swallow camels by completely ignoring the specific, allowed sins that are actually causing the darkness. Things like active malice toward a family member, a proud and arrogant behavior at work, a violent pursuit of wealth, or a daily habit of evil speaking against our neighbors.
We gloss over the specific Achan while lamenting our general vague condition.
Yes, exactly.
What does this look like today? How do we find a hidden serpent in our own bed when we are so incredibly good at deceiving ourselves? We rationalize our behavior so quickly.
We really do.
We call our bitter resentment righteous indignation. We call our covetous greed financial prudence. We call our destructive gossip sharing prayer requests. How do we actually cut through our own self-deception?
You have to stop generalizing your confessions. You have to ask yourself a very hard, very specific question. What specific outward behavior, secret habit, or bitter attitude am I justifying right now?
That is a tough question to answer, honestly.
It is. What is the thing I refuse to let go of? What is the behavior I am defending when my conscience pricks me? You must treat that specific thing like a venomous snake hiding under your pillow. The text uses that imagery.
A viper under the pillow.
If you found a viper under your head that had been secretly biting you while you slept, infecting you with poison and making you sick, you would not negotiate with it. You would not call it by a pleasant name.
You would kill it immediately.
You would destroy it with intense indignation. You would root it out completely. You must bring that same ruthless, unsparing scrutiny to your own life. Do not bribe your conscience. Dig up the floor of the tent. Find the specific Achan, pull it out into the light, and bring it to the valley of Achor.
That is a heavy charge, but it is the only way to the door of hope. We have covered an immense amount of ground today, tracing this blueprint from the wilderness of Hosea to the valley of Achor, through the Red Sea, and into the dark nights of the soul that every believer faces.
It's been quite a process to walk through.
It has. We have seen that God is not a God of cheap comfort, but a God of severe rescuing mercies. I want to leave you, the listener, with a closing consideration that builds on everything we have discussed today. What if the very spiritual dryness or anxiety you were desperately trying to medicate away with podcasts, books, or constant distraction is actually God's customized, loving invitation to the wilderness?
That's a challenging thought.
What if your current lack of peace isn't a malfunction in the system, but the exact prerequisite for the greatest joy you have ever known, waiting just on the other side of radical honesty? Dig up the tent, find the troubler, let the Valley of Achor become your door of hope. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.